Ladies and gentlemen, today we are not discussing a trend. We are not discussing a social media experiment. We are investigating a metabolic strategy. When we say olive oil fasting keeps insulin levels extremely low, we must first understand why that matters and what truly happens inside the body when insulin remains suppressed. Insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone. It is the master storage hormone. Every time we eat carbohydrates and even excessive protein, insulin rises. Its message is clear: store energy, stop burning fat, and shift the body into growth and storage mode. Chronic elevation of insulin is the silent driver behind insulin resistance, stubborn fat accumulation, metabolic syndrome, and eventually type 2 diabetes. Now here is the metabolic investigation. What determines whether insulin rises or stays low? The primary trigger for insulin release is glucose. Carbohydrates break down into glucose rapidly. Even refined carbohydrates cause sharp spikes. Protein can stimulate insulin moderately, but pure fat, particularly high-quality extra virgin olive oil, has a minimal effect on insulin secretion. This is not theory, it is physiology. Fat does not convert directly into glucose in a way that significantly elevates insulin in the short term. Therefore, when small, strategic amounts of olive oil are consumed during fasting, insulin remains near fasting baseline levels. Why is this significant? Because low insulin unlocks fat burning. As long as insulin is elevated, the body cannot efficiently access stored body fat. Insulin inhibits lipolysis, the breakdown of fat from adipose tissue. When insulin drops, hormone-sensitive lipase becomes active. Fat cells release fatty acids. The liver converts some of those fatty acids into ketones. The body shifts into a fat-adapted, metabolically flexible state. This is the metabolic switch people attempt to reach through strict fasting. But here is the deeper inquiry: why not simply water fast? In pure water fasting, insulin indeed drops. However, prolonged water fasting can trigger stress responses. Cortisol may rise. Adrenal output increases. Some individuals experience fatigue, dizziness, irritability, and eventual rebound overeating. The body perceives prolonged zero-calorie intake as a threat. This stress response can, paradoxically, impair metabolic stability for certain individuals. Now consider a small intake of olive oil during fasting. A tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil contains primarily monounsaturated fat, especially oleic acid. It provides energy without meaningfully stimulating insulin. Blood glucose remains stable. Insulin secretion remains minimal. Yet the body receives a subtle signal of energy availability. This may reduce excessive stress signaling while preserving the fasting physiology of low insulin. Low insulin is the gateway to reversing insulin resistance. Insulin resistance develops when cells are chronically exposed to high insulin levels. Receptors become desensitized. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. Over time, this cycle worsens. The solution is not more insulin, the solution is less. Periods of sustained low insulin allow receptors to resensitize. It allows cellular signaling to normalize. It reduces the constant demand placed on the pancreas. Olive oil fasting maintains that low insulin environment. There is no glucose spike. There is no large insulin surge. The metabolic state remains one of fat oxidation. Ketone production continues. The body learns to rely less on frequent carbohydrate intake and more on stored energy. This is metabolic retraining. Another layer of this inquiry involves inflammation. Chronic inflammation contributes to insulin resistance. High-quality extra virgin olive oil contains polyphenols with anti-inflammatory properties, while the caloric amount is small. These bioactive compounds may help reduce inflammatory signaling, further supporting insulin sensitivity. Thus, not only does insulin remain low, but the cellular environment becomes more favorable for proper insulin function. It is important to clarify that quantity is critical. This strategy is not about consuming large amounts of fat throughout the fasting window. Excessive caloric intake, even from healthy fat, can slow fat loss and reduce the fasting effect. The principle is controlled strategic use. The goal is to maintain insulin suppression, not to replace meals with unlimited oil. Low insulin also influences other hormonal systems. When insulin is low, glucagon rises. Growth hormone activity may increase. Fat mobilization improves. Mitochondria become more efficient at oxidizing fatty acids. Over time, this enhances metabolic flexibility, the ability to switch smoothly between glucose and fat as fuel sources. Many individuals with insulin resistance lose this flexibility. They depend on frequent carbohydrate intake because their bodies struggle to access stored fat. Sustained low insulin during olive oil fasting helps restore this adaptability. In summary, the power of olive oil fasting lies not in calories, but in hormonal signaling. Insulin remains suppressed, fat burning continues, ketones are produced, inflammation may decrease. Stress response may be moderated compared to strict water fasting. The pancreas receives rest, cells regain sensitivity, the metabolic system begins to recalibrate. This is not magic. It is endocrine physiology. When insulin stays low consistently and safely, the body regains control over energy balance. And that is where true metabolic healing begins. Key point no. To expend it in 700 words without heading to understand how olive oil fasting may enhance autophagy through AMPK activation. We must first investigate what autophagy truly represents. Autophagy is the body's internal recycling and repair system. The word itself means cell feeding, but in biological terms, it refers to a highly regulated process where damaged proteins, dysfunctional mitochondria, and cellular debris are broken down and reused. This process is not destructive. It is protective. It is one of the most powerful anti-aging and disease prevention mechanisms built into human physiology. Autophagy does not operate at full speed when we are constantly eating. In fact, it is suppressed by insulin and by a nutrient-sensing pathway known as mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin. When insulin is high and nutrients are abundant, the body prioritizes growth and storage. Repair takes a secondary role. But when nutrients decline and insulin drops, the metabolic environment shifts. The body moves from growth mode into maintenance and repair mode. This is when autophagy begins to increase. One of the primary regulators of this shift is AMPK, AMP-activated protein kinase. AMPK is often described as the cell's energy sensor. When cellular energy levels fall, AMPK becomes activated. It signals that fuel is limited and that efficiency is required. Once activated, AMPK suppresses mTOR activity and promotes catabolic processes, including fat oxidation and autophagy. In simple terms, AMPK tells the body, conserve energy, burn stored fuel, and clean up damaged cellular components. Fasting is a well-established activator of AMPK. When caloric intake drops, ATP production declines slightly, and AMP levels rise within cells. This shift triggers AMPK activation. As AMPK rises, insulin levels fall, fat burning increases, and autophagic pathways are stimulated. This is one reason fasting has been associated with longevity and metabolic improvement. At first glance, consuming any calories during fasting might appear to interrupt autophagy. However, the metabolic response depends heavily on the type of nutrient consumed. Carbohydrates sharply raise insulin and activate mTOR, which suppresses autophagy. Protein can also stimulate insulin and strongly activate mTOR due to amino acid signaling. Fat, particularly monounsaturated fat from high-quality extra virgin olive oil, behaves differently. Olive oil contains primarily oleic acid, a monounsaturated fatty acid, along with a range of polyphenols such as oleuropein and hydroxytyrosol. These compounds have been studied for their anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. Emerging research suggests that certain polyphenols may influence cellular signaling pathways, including AMPK activation. When small, controlled amounts of olive oil are consumed during fasting, insulin remains extremely low because fat has minimal immediate impact on glucose levels. With insulin suppressed, mTOR activity remains relatively reduced compared to carbohydrate or protein intake. This creates a metabolic environment that does not strongly inhibit autophagy. Furthermore, some studies indicate that polyphenols found in olive oil may independently stimulate AMPK activity. AMPK activation enhances mitochondrial efficiency, increases fat oxidation, and supports cellular stress resistance. By supporting AMPK signaling, olive oil may help sustain aspects of the fasting, induced repair state rather than completely shutting it down. Another important factor is oxidative stress. During metabolic transitions such as prolonged fasting, the body increases fat oxidation, which can produce reactive oxygen species. While moderate oxidative stress can trigger beneficial adaptation, excessive oxidative stress may impair cellular function. The antioxidants in high polyphenol olive oil may help buffer excessive oxidative damage while still allowing adaptive stress signaling. In this way, the environment for autophagy becomes more balanced and sustainable. There is also the question of sustainability. Strict water-only fasting can be difficult for many individuals. If stress hormones rise excessively or if adherence fails, the potential benefits may never be realized. A structured approach that includes small amounts of olive oil may improve compliance while preserving many of the molecular signals associated with fasting, including AMPK activation and low insulin levels. It is important to clarify that autophagy is not an on-off switch. It exists on a spectrum. The degree of activation depends on nutrient status, hormonal environment, energy balance, and cellular stress. The goal is not necessarily maximal deprivation, but consistent signaling that favors repair over constant growth stimulation. By keeping insulin low, minimizing mTOR activation, potentially stimulating AMPK through both energy signaling and polyphenol activity, and reducing excessive inflammation, olive oil fasting may help create a metabolic state conducive to sustained autophagic activity. The emphasis remains on moderation. Excessive fat intake would increase caloric load and could reduce the energetic stress necessary for AMPK activation. The strategy relies on small, intentional quantities. In summary, autophagy depends on low insulin, suppressed mTOR, and active AMPK. Fasting initiates this cascade. Olive oil, when used strategically, may support elements of this pathway by maintaining low insulin levels and potentially enhancing AMP signaling through its bioactive compound. The process is not mystical. It is cellular biochemistry responding to energy availability, nutrient quality, and hormonal balance. When these variables align, the body shifts toward repair, resilience, and metabolic renewal. High polyphenol extra virgin olive oil is not merely a source of calories. It is a complex biological substance rich in protective compounds that influence oxidative stress at the cellular level. To understand why reducing oxidative stress matters, we must first investigate what oxidative stress actually is and how it affects metabolic health. Every cell in the human body produces energy through the mitochondria. During this process, reactive oxygen species, often called free radicals, are generated as natural byproducts. In controlled amounts, these molecules are not harmful. In fact, they serve signaling functions and help trigger adaptive responses. However, when reactive oxygen species accumulate beyond the body's antioxidant capacity, oxidative stress develops. This imbalance can damage proteins, lipids, and DNA. Over time, it contributes to inflammation, insulin resistance, accelerated aging, and chronic metabolic disease. Now consider what happens during metabolic dysfunction. Chronic high blood sugar increases oxidative stress. Excess insulin and elevated triglycerides also contribute. The more unstable the blood glucose levels, the greater the production of reactive oxygen species. This creates a cycle. Oxidative stress worsens insulin resistance, and insulin resistance increases oxidative stress. Breaking this cycle is essential for metabolic repair. High polyphenol extra virgin olive oil enters this investigation as a powerful modulator of oxidative balance. Unlike refined oils, genuine extra virgin olive oil is mechanically extracted without excessive heat or chemical processing. This preserves its natural phenolic compounds, including hydroxytyrosol, oleuropein, tyrosol, and olecanthal. These are not minor components. They are biologically active molecules with measurable antioxidant effects. Polyphenols function by neutralizing free radicals before they can damage cellular structures. They donate electrons to unstable reactive oxygen species, stabilizing them and preventing chain reactions of lipid peroxidation. Lipid peroxidation is particularly harmful because it damages cell membranes, including those of mitochondria. When mitochondrial membranes are compromised, energy production declines and further oxidative stress is generated. By protecting membrane integrity, polyphenols help preserve efficient cellular respiration. There is also a gene regulatory component to consider. Certain olive oil polyphenols activate pathways such as NRF2, nuclear factor erythroid 2 related factor 2, which controls the expression of endogenous antioxidant enzymes. When NRF2 is activated, the body increases production of glutathione, superoxide dismutase, and catalase, its own internal antioxidant defense systems. This is not merely external scavenging of free radicals. It is amplification of the body's intrinsic protective machinery. Now examine this in the context of fasting. During fasting or carbohydrate restriction, the body increases fat oxidation. This metabolic shift is beneficial for insulin sensitivity and fat loss. However, increased fat metabolism can transiently elevate reactive oxygen species production as mitochondria process higher amounts of fatty acids. While moderate oxidative stress can promote adaptation, excessive stress may undermine cellular function. High polyphenol olive oil may provide a buffering effect by supplying antioxidant compounds during this metabolic transition. It may reduce excessive oxidative damage while allowing beneficial signaling to continue. This creates a more stable internal environment, one that supports mitochondrial efficiency instead of overwhelming it. Another dimension involves inflammation. Oxidative stress and inflammation are tightly connected. Reactive oxygen species activate inflammatory signaling pathways such as NF-kappa B. Once inflammation rises, it further increases oxidative stress, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Olive oil polyphenols, particularly olecanthal, have been shown to exhibit anti-inflammatory properties similar to mild nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory compounds, though naturally occurring in gentler in effect. By dampening inflammatory signaling, oxidative burden can also decline. The quality of olive oil is critical in this discussion. Not all olive oils contain high levels of polyphenols. Refining processes remove many of these compounds, leaving primarily fat without the same antioxidant profile. High polyphenol extra virgin olive oil typically has a peppery or slightly bitter taste, an indicator of its phenolic content. Storage conditions, harvest timing, and processing methods all influence polyphenol concentration. Therefore, the metabolic benefit is linked not just to olive oil in general, but specifically to high-quality, minimally processed varieties. Reducing oxidative stress has direct implications for insulin sensitivity. When oxidative damage affects insulin receptors or intracellular signaling proteins, glucose uptake becomes impaired. By lowering oxidative burden, receptor function can improve. Additionally, preserving mitochondrial integrity enhances metabolic flexibility, allowing cells to switch efficiently between glucose and fat as fuel sources. Long-term oxidative stress is also associated with endothelial dysfunction, which affects vascular health. The Mediterranean dietary pattern, rich in extra virgin olive oil, has consistently been associated with improved cardiovascular markers. While many factors contribute, the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties of olive oil polyphenols are believed to play a significant role. In the broader metabolic inquiry, high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil represents more than an energy source. It acts as a molecular signal modulator, an antioxidant amplifier, and an inflammation regulator. During structured fasting or carbohydrate restriction, its compounds may help stabilize oxidative balance, protect mitochondrial function, and support long-term metabolic resilience. This is not about eliminating oxidative stress entirely. That would be biologically impossible and undesirable. It is about balance. When oxidative stress is controlled rather than excessive, the body adapts, repairs, and strengthens. High polyphenol extra virgin olive oil contributes to that balance, making it a strategic component in metabolic optimization, rather than simply a dietary fat. To understand how olive oil supports ketone production during fasting, we must first examine what ketosis truly represents and why it matters in metabolic health. Ketosis is not a trend, it is a natural physiological state. It occurs when the body shifts from relying primarily on glucose for energy to using fat-derived molecules known as ketones. This transition reflects metabolic flexibility, the ability to adapt fuel usage based on availability. Under normal eating patterns dominated by carbohydrates, glucose serves as the primary energy source. Insulin rises to manage blood sugar and store excess energy. As long as insulin remains elevated, fat burning is suppressed. The body continues to depend on circulating glucose. However, when carbohydrate intake drops or fasting begins, insulin levels decline. This hormonal shift unlocks stored fat from adipose tissue through a process called lipolysis. Fatty acids are released into the bloodstream and transported to the liver. Inside the liver, these fatty acids undergo beta oxidation, a process that converts them into acetyl-CoA. When carbohydrate availability is low and glycogen stores are depleted, acetyl-CoA accumulates and is redirected toward ketone production. The liver synthesizes ketone bodies, primarily beta, hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and acetone. These molecules travel through the bloodstream and serve as efficient fuel for the brain, muscles, and other tissues. Extra virgin olive oil is composed mainly of monounsaturated fat, particularly oleic acid. Unlike carbohydrates, it does not significantly raise blood glucose. Unlike protein, it does not strongly stimulate insulin secretion when consumed in modest amounts. This is critical. Ketone production depends heavily on maintaining low insulin levels. If insulin rises, lipolysis slows, fatty acid release declines, and ketogenesis diminishes. When small, controlled amounts of olive oil are consumed during fasting, insulin remains near baseline fasting levels. There is minimal disruption to the hormonal environment required for ketone production. In fact, by providing readily oxidizable fat, olive oil may supply additional substrate for hepatic beta oxidation without triggering a glucose response. The liver continues converting fatty acids into ketones because the metabolic signal, low insulin and low glucose, remains intact. Another dimension to consider is energy stability. During early fasting, some individuals experience fatigue, headaches, or brain fog as the body transitions from glucose dependence to fat reliance. This adaptation phase can be uncomfortable and may reduce adherence. A modest intake of olive oil can provide caloric support without halting ketosis. The brain and muscles still rely on fat-derived energy, and ketone production continues. The body remains in a fat-burning mode while experiencing less abrupt energy decline. There is also a mitochondrial component. Ketones are not merely alternative fuel, they are efficient fuel. Beta-hydroxybutyrate produces more ATP per unit of oxygen compared to glucose in certain contexts. This may improve cellular energy efficiency. By supporting ongoing ketone production, olive oil fasting may help maintain mitochondrial output while preserving the metabolic benefits of carbohydrate restriction. Furthermore, ketones themselves are signaling molecules. Beta-hydroxybutyrate influences gene expression related to oxidative stress resistance and inflammation reduction. It can inhibit histone deacetylases, thereby promoting cellular stress resilience pathways. Sustained ketone production, therefore, does more than supply energy. It communicates adaptive signals within the cell. It is important to clarify that olive oil does not directly convert into ketones. The body must first metabolize its fatty acids. However, because insulin remains low and carbohydrate intake is absent, the liver continues the ketogenesis process. In this way, Olive oil acts as a supportive fuel source rather than an interrupting nutrient. Quantity remains crucial. Excessive fat intake, even from olive oil, may reduce the body's need to mobilize stored fat. If caloric intake becomes too high, the energetic stress necessary for robust ketosis may diminish. The strategy relies on moderation, providing enough fat to sustain energy and compliance, but not so much that the fasting metabolic state is overridden. Another factor involves blood sugar stability. Rapid fluctuations in glucose can suppress ketone production. Olive oil, by not influencing blood sugar significantly, maintains stable glycemic levels. This stability reinforces the hormonal environment required for ongoing ketogenesis. Over time, consistent support of ketone production enhances metabolic flexibility. The body becomes more efficient at switching between glucose and fat as fuel sources. Individuals who previously depended on frequent carbohydrate intake begin to access stored fat more easily. Energy levels become steadier. Cravings may decline. Insulin sensitivity often improves as reliance on constant glucose diminishes. In the broader metabolic context, supporting ketone production during fasting is not about chasing high ketone numbers. It is about maintaining a hormonal and cellular environment where fat oxidation predominates. Olive oil, when used strategically, aligns with this objective by preserving low insulin, supplying oxidizable fat, and stabilizing energy during the fasting window. The mechanism is grounded in biochemistry, not speculation. Low insulin enables lipolysis. Lipolysis provides fatty acids. The liver converts fatty acids into ketones. Olive oil supports this chain without disrupting it. As long as carbohydrate intake remains absent and quantity remains controlled, ketone production continues. To understand how olive oil fasting may reduce stress hormone spikes compared to strict water-only fasting, we must first examine what happens hormonally when the body perceives a threat to energy supply. The human body is designed for survival. When caloric intake suddenly drops to zero, complex adaptive systems activate to maintain blood glucose and protect vital organs. These adaptations are not harmful in short bursts, but excessive or prolonged activation can create unintended metabolic stress. During a strict water fast, insulin levels fall rapidly. This is beneficial for fat burning and metabolic reset. However, as glycogen stores deplete and glucose availability declines, the body must ensure that blood sugar does not fall too low. To accomplish this, it increases production of stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline epinephrine. These hormones stimulate gluconeogenesis, a process where the liver generates glucose from non-carbohydrate sources such as amino acids. They also promote the release of stored energy. Cortisol, in particular, plays a central role. It mobilizes amino acids from muscle tissue, increases blood glucose, and supports the stress response. In moderate amounts, cortisol is essential. It helps maintain energy balance during fasting. But when cortisol rises excessively or remains elevated for prolonged periods, several consequences may follow. Sleep can be disrupted, mood may become unstable, muscle breakdown may increase, blood sugar may fluctuate. Over time, high cortisol itself can contribute to insulin resistance. Now consider the practical challenge. Many individuals attempt extended water fasting but struggle with irritability, fatigue, headaches, or overwhelming hunger. Part of this discomfort arises from the sharp shift in fuel availability. and the associated rise in stress signaling. The body interprets total caloric absence as a potential emergency. Even though fasting can be therapeutic, the biological systems involved are designed for survival, not comfort. This is where the concept of olive oil fasting introduces a nuanced approach. When a small controlled amount of extra virgin olive oil is consumed during a fasting window, the hormonal picture changes subtly. Insulin remains very low because fat does not significantly elevate blood glucose. However, the body detects incoming energy. This small caloric signal may reduce the perception of severe deprivation. By supplying fat-based energy, olive oil provides substrate for beta oxidation without requiring gluconeogenesis to the same extent. As fatty acids are oxidized, ketone production continues and tissues receive fuel. The brain, once adapted to ketones, can rely on them efficiently. With a more stable energy supply, the demand for excessive cortisol-driven glucose production may decrease. It is important to understand that cortisol will still rise during fasting. That is normal and necessary. The goal is not to eliminate stress hormones, but to prevent exaggerated spikes that may undermine metabolic stability. A modest intake of fat may soften the stress response while preserving the core fasting benefits of low insulin and increased fat oxidation. There is also a psychological dimension. Extreme hunger and energy crashes can increase perceived stress. Perceived stress itself influences hormonal output. When individuals feel deprived or physically distressed, sympathetic nervous system activation intensifies. By stabilizing energy levels through minimal fat intake, adherence improves and perceived stress may decline. Lower psychological stress can translate into a more balanced hormonal profile. Another layer involves muscle preservation. During prolonged water fasting, especially in individuals who are not fully fat adapted, the body may rely more heavily on amino acids for gluconeogenesis. Elevated cortisol accelerates this process. While short-term muscle loss may be minimal, repeated cycles combined with poor adaptation could compromise lean mass. Providing small amounts of dietary fat reduces reliance on amino acids as an emergency fuel source. This may help moderate excessive protein breakdown, particularly in the early stages of fasting adaptation. Stable energy availability also supports thyroid function and metabolic rate regulation. Extreme caloric restriction over time can signal the body to downregulate metabolic output as a protective mechanism. A gentler fasting approach that includes minimal fat intake may reduce the intensity of this adaptation, though total caloric intake and duration still matter. Quality remains essential. The type of fat consumed influences inflammation and oxidative stress. High-quality extra virgin olive oil contains polyphenols that may reduce inflammatory signaling. Lower inflammation can indirectly support balanced cortisol rhythms because chronic inflammation itself can stimulate stress hormone production. However, moderation is critical. Large amounts of olive oil would increase total caloric intake significantly and may blunt the metabolic advantages of fasting. The concept relies on strategic minimalism, enough to provide metabolic stability, not enough to exit the fasting state. The broader principle is this: the body responds not only to what we eat, but to how severely we restrict. When restriction becomes extreme, stress pathways intensify. When restriction is structured intelligently, the body can transition into fat burning with less hormonal turbulence. Olive oil fasting, when practiced carefully, may represent a middle ground. Insulin remains low. Ketosis continues. Autophagic processes may still operate, yet the stress response may be moderated compared to zero-calorie fasting. The pancreas rests. Fat oxidation persists. Cortisol rises only as much as necessary, not excessively. In metabolic optimization, sustainability often determines success. A strategy that reduces extreme stress hormone spikes while preserving fat burning physiology may offer a more practical pathway for many individuals. The objective is not maximal deprivation, but controlled adaptation, allowing the body to shift into repair mode without triggering unnecessary alarm signals.